Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, coming back to you with more Archon's Armory. Got a special treat, a double upload tonight. Going to get all you folks who've been so kind and appreciative of this information a little special on a Monday afternoon. Now, this probably is going to be a little bit quick for the schedule, but I'll try and keep these rolling out as consistently as I possibly can. We have so much ground to cover. I can already see people asking about future pieces, and don't worry, they're coming. Today we are talking about the autocannon. Let's jump right into it. The mythos. Now, in most of these videos when I talk about mythos, I talk about things that a daily interest person, someone who isn't into the lore, someone who hasn't really considered the underlying factors of the setting itself, might think are the case, where they might have a incorrect idea of how things are laid out in the lore, or logic, of course, where lore fails us, which is so often the case in 40k. In this case, it is with the autocannon. There's less outright myths and memery that obfuscates the actual intent of what the autocannon is, and more just some simple misunderstandings about what is and what is not an autocannon. So, in general, you will have three different types of these. You have support, which are more the Imperial Guard and really just the human standard. The support weapons have tripods, they're equipped with multiple person crews in order to keep them equipped, reloaded, and effectively running. Personal autocannons are really restricted to Space Marines. And this is one of the videos where we will be talking about Space Marines a whole lot more than we'll be talking about the average Imperial Guardsman, because in terms of defense and use, the Space Marine is going to get a good deal more individual power out of the autocannon than, say, a standard Imperial Guardsman, because he and his buddies are going to have to haul it around. So, as an individual or personnel weapon, it is pretty much unique to the Space Marine, whether he is in Terminator armor or whether he is in some sort of Devastator pattern, of which there are several. And then finally, we have vehicle autocannons. Now, I will be doing a separate video very soon, possibly the second one tonight, on the cannons of 40k. And this will include almost every kinetic firing weapon in the entirety of the setting, but I decided to put autocannons aside, as they not only come in different forms that are unique amongst themselves, but they also have a lot more disambiguation to be done, where people are confused or possibly misled about what is and is not an autocannon. A lot of this comes from vehicle autocannons, because 40k has a strange tendency to like to use certain words instead of the word autocannon. For example, certain weapons are denoted as stubbers or as some fancy version of cannon, when in reality they're just autocannons. So, that will be a separation mythos. Autocannons versus bolters. Now, this really comes down to what side of the Space Marine, venue you're on. Are you more of a Chaos fan, in which case you'll probably see the bolter as, a very standard infantry weapon that has no real chance of taking down a true Space Marine, at least with a less than severe sustained burst or extreme close-range point shooting. Or you are on the side of the Imperium, where you view bolters as the be-all, end-all of infantry weapons, and they are perfectly capable of, well, dealing with almost any threat in the galaxy. Now, I believe that the truth is somewhere in between that, but we'll save the criticism and or glorification of the bolt gun for another video. For the moment, we're going to talk about the autocannon versus the bolter. They differ in many ways, and we will be going over some of them in this video, but this will be an attempt to ensure that there is a separation made, and that the various pluses and minuses between the autocannon and its contemporaries, the heavy bolter, the bolt gun, the assault cannon, the rotor cannon, and various other similar but not exactly the same weapons will be measured. Finally, the last two, technology and technicality issues. Some of these technicalities will come back to what is an autocannon and what is a heavy stubber, as the upper level of heavy stubbers tends to blend into the autocannon realm very easily, and with a little bit of confusion in the terms, as mentioned before, as to what's an autocannon in the vehicle autocannon section, this can become an issue with technicalities. And finally, technology. There are, of course, with many things in 40k, the upper level and the lower level of technology. Matter of fact, I would argue that the pictures here, this Iron Warrior with his backpack-held two-handed autocannon on its automatic sling, in his Type 3 Heresy armor, is probably on the upper end of autocannons in terms of personal equipment, whereas the standard cassette-loading magazine, single-barrel, high-recoil infantry cannon that's on the top, I would consider the lower end of autocannons, in terms of technology, if not caliber, as those tend to be fairly large. And finally, usefulness. Is it garbage or is it godlike? This comes back again to that, do you fall on the chaos side of things, or do you fall on the imperial side of things? Generally, the Imperium views anyone using an autocannon individually as rather vulnerable. Quite often when you see shorts, animations, movies, or lore, autocannons are seen as a minor threat. Where in reality they should be hitting at similar strengths and levels to the heavy bolter in most cases. They are discounted quite often by enemies who should most certainly fear its power. We will be going over the heavy bolter in another video with the bolt gun, of course, but for the moment we're going to try and suss out exactly how strong the autocannon is in comparison to, again, its relative contemporaries. Moving on to the reality of the autocannon, and that might sound very, obtuse or objective because I'm taking this all on faith, because there's not really much written about the autocannon other than some general characteristics. Now, obviously, the autocannon is a kinetic weapon, but what does it stack up against? In general, I count it as somewhere between the heavier cannons and the bolt guns. It is objectively superior in terms of hitting power and damage to the heavy stubber, even though it shares in some cases many similarities to the heavy stubber. It is a decidedly different weapon based on two things, if nothing else. The first one would be its sheer size and weight. A heavy stubber, while it may need a tripod or a bipod in order to fire, it is still generally man-portable. Even if it would take a team of two to move a tripod, to move a super heavy stubber, or something on the range of like a Maxim gun, a water-cooled machine gun, that is still a two-man team. The autocannon is likely going to require that it stays attached to a wheeled carriage while it moves, or in the absolute lightest versions, they are carried by larger teams and are pretty much impossible to fire from the hip. As far as I know, outside of Space Marines and Terminators, there are very few living beings that use the autocannon at all from a standing position. In general, they are fired from a squat, much like the Kriegsman's models are shown, or they are fired from belly down, in a defensive capability where they are mounted. So, much heavier than heavy stubber, and in terms of ammunition, they are more on par in terms of sheer damage and caliber with bolt guns and heavy bolters. As we will talk about, the heavy bolter having somewhere between a 35 and 37 millimeter bolt, and the bolt guns having either the human version will have roughly a 20 to 22 millimeter round, and the bolt gun having a 25 to 26.5 millimeter round. The autocannon goes all the way from the ranges of 15 to 16 millimeters up to the sheer sizes of almost 90 millimeters in the autocannons that are on certain Titans and Knights. In the more average, though, in terms of what an infantryman could expect to find, he will find an autocannon that is somewhere between the ranges of 15 millimeters and 35 millimeters. 35 is really kind of pushing it. In terms of things that can be mounted and moved by a human being. 40 millimeter autocannons tend to be the domain of vehicles, and even 37 and 35 millimeter cannons are more suited to Terminators and Space Marines than they are to humans hauling them around, just out of sheer size and, of course, the weight of ammunition. Moving on. the affordability and simplicity. Now, as with the autogun and most other kinetic weapons within the Imperium, affordability and simplicity are on their side in comparison to something like a bolt gun or even a heavy bolter, which is more common than the bolt gun in terms of its production and ammunition, but that production and ammunition requires the same specialty materials that the bolt gun does, including its ammo, which is quite hard to produce, whereas the autocannon's ammunition can be very, very simplistic. Matter of fact, it has the same advantage of the autogun, which is that you can make it as simple as you want. Would you like a solid steel round? That might not be great for clearing out trenches, but it will certainly damage light vehicles, or heavy vehicles if it's a high enough caliber autogun, or autocannon. Affordability, the autocannon tends to not be locally produced, and while it might be in some specific cases, it's a lot rarer than the autogun, or I would say theoretically a lot of other support weapons, due to the fact that it is a mechanical weapon. It is not like a heavy stubber where it has a simple feed mechanism for low caliber rounds that works off of recoil. It is very much a mechanized reloading system that, while it may use recoil to assist it, the cassette ammunition the cassette ammunition carriers, such as these ones up above and in the previous slide, these round carriers that have sets of rounds in them, almost like a drum magazine, are probably the simplest half gravity fed ones that you will have, and even that requires that you have a fairly robust system to extract those rounds and in order to feed them in without damaging the gun or causing it to jam consistently. So, in terms of affordability and simplicity, it is not the cheapest support weapon you can get, but it is most certainly a blame sight cheaper than buying something like a las cannon or possibly even a heavy bolter. It would most certainly be on par with the heavy bolter, because the heavy bolter is so common and you can purchase it from forges relatively cheaply, and even from industrial worlds, but autocannons most certainly are capable of being built on the cheap side of things. So unlike the heavy bolter, it isn't just prohibited from planets that are not so high on the industrial chains yet. Moving on, as mentioned, the autocannon is decidedly heavier than either the autogun, and even in many cases it will be heavier than the heavy bolter. This is mainly due to the fact that, unlike the bolter, it has to worry about having a long barrel to ensure maximum powder burn from its higher caliber rounds. This longer barrel, coupled with the fact that it uses larger ammunition by length, if not by width, than the heavy bolter, it has to have a longer chamber, it has to have a larger recoil device that helps compensate for the huge rounds that it's shooting out, and, unlike the heavy bolter, due to the high recoil, it will need a management system. What I mean by that big wheeled tripod would be a great example. It needs to have some sort of pintle or method in which to move around with it. There are autocannons that can be used by humans. They are on the very, very low end, and it would be difficult to distinguish them from a heavy stubber that's had a couple of modifications to it. But again, these are going to have to be used by individuals either on their stomach, using a bipod or tripod, or they're going to have to be used by people who have unnatural strength. This becomes a thing with chaos. Quite often you will have individuals who are capable of maneuvering and firing these weapons, if not accurately, at least at all. Colonel Strachan style, or whoever that gentleman is who uses a heavy bolter from the hip, who is an insane person, but, he's super strong, so he gets to do it. Same thing with Chaos Cultists. You will have individuals who are of incredible strength, who are capable of manhandling the lower levels of autocannon, but I couldn't imagine that being possible with anything above 20 millimeters, and quite honestly, firing a 20 millimeter autocannon from the hip, you're likely only going to get one round on target, and that target better not be far away. But 16 millimeters, 17 millimeters, those kind of high or super heavy machine gun calibers, that would be a lot more possible. And quite effective, of course. Moving on to standards by caliber. As mentioned, we will go over this, but the only real standard in the autocannon are these. It has to be of a caliber higher or at least equal to the heaviest of heavy stubbers. It must be a long or at least medium cartridge compared to rifle cartridges, and it has to be equipped with a full barrel, essentially. Cutting it down like the heavy bolter will not work because the rounds that it fires have to be going at a certain speed due to their length. Otherwise, you'll be wasting the capacity of the bullet, essentially, as unburned powder will simply spray out of the end. In terms of caliber, I usually separate them into small, medium, and large, and we will go over that in a bit. The other standard is that it has to be self-loading and capable of at least semi-automatic fire, though a vast majority are capable of full auto fire. The ones that are semi-automatic are really kind of self-reloading cannons, and those are ones that you would more expect from a very simplistic world that is using World War I style technology. AX Cardinal, some of the really low-level industrial worlds, and of course, Chaos will have the cheaper, less effective, less efficient versions of these that are a lot closer to a heavy autogun or even an anti-materiel rifle than they are to a true autocannon. And these are made out of either desperation or because it's, purpose-built. It's made for a sniper unit rather than a heavy weapons unit. And finally, replacement. In general, as mentioned, a majority of the decent autocannons that are going to be used by the Imperium are produced on Forge Worlds. This is for a lot of reasons. The main one is just the quality of materials required and the complexity of some of the shells. The standard shell for the autocannon is probably either armor-piercing high explosive or armor-piercing tracer. And by armor-piercing, I really just mean it's a steel round with a head that is made out of, either a cap or a very basic, just shaped ballistic cap. This standard round obviously is not consistent between weapons, but in terms of replacing either the ammunition or the weapon, it's more difficult to repair the more complex you go. So the very, very basic ones essentially just slide a rifle pack into this larger form here. You have like your pistol grip, and you have your action here in the back of the gun, and then you have the actual mechanism that has to take all the wear and tear. Replacing those parts are probably not impossible for an Imperial Guard regiment. For other forces, they might be very difficult, but unlike a las cannon or other high-technology weapons, it is entirely analog. Apart from some of the higher versions have very complex reloading systems. For example, this Terminator version down here, this Chaos Terminator Hades autocannon, I think they call it. This would definitely require a tech priest to fix, just because it's got, a whole self-reloading system here. It's got a separate trigger to the barrel. It's very much not analog. It's going to be using a lot of secondary systems. It's going to have lots of little bits and pieces that you need to take care of. Or it's a chaos weapon, in which case, it doesn't need taking care of. But in general, it's more complicated than a simple infantry weapon, of course, because it is a heavy weapon, but it is more replaceable in terms of bits and pieces that might fall off or get damaged than a las cannon or a high-technology weapon like a multi-laser. Finally, beauty, form factor, and training. Need I say more? The autocannon is one of the most beautiful weapons in all of 40k. It's a giant machine gun. I really don't feel like I need to explain how glorious and beautiful that is, but at least for the video, let us just say that these are quite impressive, and I like them a lot. It took a lot of restraint for me to make this the third video instead of the first, because people dumpster on the autocannon as being trash, and I tend to like them quite a bit. And finally, training. There is no modern equivalent to the autocannon in most armies. The closest thing that we had were three things. One is the M2 50 cal, the M2 Browning. It is close in that it is a high caliber 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun. Again, that's closer to a heavy stubber, and the way that it's used is also very heavy stubber. It's just used to shatter protection, which is more like an autocannon, but in general, it's still used like a machine gun. The Dushka, the 14.7 millimeter Russian heavy machine gun that they use on their tanks and a whole bunch of other stuff, that's more towards the mark. But what you really need to think of are anti-aircraft guns, either of the Second World War period or of the modern period in Russia and in other second-rate military countries. So the 23mm Shilka is a great example, or the Shevak are great examples of autocannons that would fit in well in 40K because of how they work. They're recoil operated, they're air cooled, they're very basic in their manufacture and design, and they're just a little bit too big for you to handle on your own as an infantryman. Obviously, those are used for anti-aircraft duty because, well, cannons, of course. But in 40K, there's many more things that a standard infantry weapon won't put down. So the autocannon, in that case, would be correct. The other one that you would want to think about in terms of caliber are the 20mm anti-aircraft guns from World War II, or the anti-tank rifles from World War II. So when we get to the lowest level of autocannons, those kind of homegrown solutions to enemies with medium armor like orcs or Eldar, or light vehicles like, some resistance forces will get their hands on armored cars or things of that nature. If you want to build something that will particularly deal with those problems, you would definitely want an autocannon, and if you have not a lot of technology, you will pick up a solution similar to something like the Lati, the Finnish 20mm anti-tank sniper rifle, or rather anti-tank rifle, a semi-automatic or bolt-action 20mm cannon would actually fit in very well, even though it was an anti-tank rifle in our day, with the autocannons of 40K. Moving on. The pros and cons of the autocannon. Here we have some lovely vehicle-grade autocannons. Definitely, I think, either a knight or a... No, this is a knight's weapon for sure. And then one of the coolest Lehman Russes, in my opinion, the one with dual autocannons. I can't imagine what this would be used for, other than just mowing down hordes of medium to heavy armored enemies, or really messing up heavily armored ones. And of course, the most intelligent thing would be to equip these with a las cannon in the hull to deal with things that the autocannons can't deal with, of which I will explain to you is a very small number of things. So, when I was talking about variable sizes, this is definitely a pro. You can custom order an autocannon to do a job and not have too much gun for that job. On the small end, you will have 15mm, 17mm, 20mm, and 23mm. 23mm is about as high as I can go before I find it unreasonable for a team of 2 to 3 men to carry around the gun and the chassis, whatever it may be, whatever wheels it may have, or whatever tripod it may be equipped with, in addition to all the ammunition. Because you really have to think, if this is being used by a guard regiment, or even by some other group in the galaxy, an autocannon is generally going to be fully automatic, and when it isn't, it's going to be firing at least semi-auto, so it's chunk, 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 chunk. And that's going to chew through ammunition very quickly, and even with 15mm rounds, if we're talking those big cassette magazines, which you'll often see on plenty of autocannons here, for example, this Knight one has 2 big cassette magazines, those can't really hold, for an infantry weapon, those couldn't hold more than 30 or 40 rounds apiece. And if you're talking about a belt of 15mm magazines, or 15mm bullets, 15mm cartridges, my goodness, and you have 30 of them, that's going to be a whole strip. You're going to need to put that over your shoulder, in your backpack, wound up around your waist, and that's going to weigh a solid 10-15 pounds. And I don't know about you, but most soldiers don't want to be carrying 45 pounds of extra kit for a weapon they might be servicing and not actually using. Granted, the Imperial Guard have the advantage of having a main weapon, which doesn't really weigh all that much, but still, the dude who has to hump around 500 rounds of 23mm ammo must really hate his life, because that is incredibly heavy. That's the reason I don't go above that for small. Medium, 24mm to 40mm. These are the ones where you really have to have a split trail. It's got to have a trailer. Most of the ones on the higher end of this are absolutely going to need a vehicle to tow them around. Beyond 35 millimeters. Again, 25 millimeter, 24, 25, and I would say 26 or 27. That's really pushing it for ones that you are going to be pushing around the battlefield on a wheeled track with either a vehicle or a horse, or maybe just humping it yourself. You know, if you have two guys who are really strong and they pull up the split trail, which is what this thing uses as a chassis. If you pull up the split trail and you both kind of really lug it to the next position, but you're not going to be grabbing it like a heavy machine gun and hauling it around to the next position to install it. It's going to be a thing of, great, we've pushed them back a few hundred yards, move up the autocannon, get it into position, load up some sandbags, we're going to be here all night, boys. And in that case, one of the issues with, ammunition is not as big of an issue with the medium ones, because unlike the small ones, which you're expected to hump around the battlefield with you and run around with them and essentially use them on the offensive, you would not ask a soldier an unaided soldier or a squad of soldiers to just haul around a 25 millimeter autocannon. Even when those existed in our history, they were always on a trail, which is to say like a chassis or like a gun carriage, and they would be equipped with very large wheels, and when they did have to be moved, they would be moved by truck or by horse. But in 40K, it's going to be more often by truck. But, in theory, you could still haul those around the battlefield, but you wouldn't be happy about it, and you certainly wouldn't be doing it, on the offensive. Maybe if you had to retreat with it, that would be more reasonable. But once you get past 30 millimeters, unless you're a Space Marine, and one of my favorite weapons is actually the 35 millimeter single-barreled autocannon that Chaos Terminators use. Some Iron Warriors use it as well, but in general, Chaos Space Marines and Space Marines will use either the very high end of small. If they're a normal Marine or a Devastator or something like that, they'll use something between 23 and 25 millimeters. So somewhere in that heavy small or light medium range. Still infantry portable, but with a Marine, it becomes capable of being used on the offensive side of things. And of course, at the Terminator level of things, you get to go up 10 millimeters. So a Terminator lugging around an absolutely massive 35 millimeter, semi-automatic autocannon, bracing it with another arm and then using it like a Devastator it's just very interesting to me. I love that concept. You see it occasionally with Marines that are in, it's generally Chaos Terminators, because the other Chaos group that uses them are the Dreadnoughts. Occasionally you will find the good old-fashioned Venerable Dreadnought equipped with either a saw blade and 35 millimeter single barrel, or a single arm blade and a 35 millimeter single barrel, which I will show in another thing. But if it's on a Dreadnought, it actually gets to be fully automatic, which is lovely. And then we get to the things above 35 millimeters, which is where we kind of go into large. Medium, as I said, it's going to require a trail or a chassis. At 40 millimeters, you're really pushing what you can expect a group of people to move around the battlefield without the help of a vehicle. A 40 millimeter autocannon that is expected to fire fully automatic, or even one that fires semi-automatic, is going to be incredibly heavy. Its trail is going to require massive wheels. It's probably going to need to be partially disassembled just to get it ready to move, to limber and unlimber the gun. But really, 40 millimeter autocannons are most often going to be found on light vehicles, or really commonly you're going to find them as secondaries on bigger vehicles. And then we finally get to the large ones. Large autocannons are really what you would say are equipped to the main armament of a vehicle. For example, I would say that the Lehman Russ here with 2 autocannons is probably going to be in the caliber ranges of somewhere between 45 millimeters and 60 millimeters. Maybe even 40 to 60. Somewhere in there. My personal bet was 50 millimeters, because they're nice and short and roughly the same length as the las cannon. But even that, a paired 50 millimeter autocannon is absolutely horrifying, and up to 90 millimeters. So you might say, well, how the absolute heck do you have a 90 millimeter fully automatic cannon? Answer is Titans and Knights. Now, Knights, and especially Armigers, it gets really questionable as to what caliber their guns are, because we have very little information. But because the Knights' weapons, even their quote-unquote battle cannons, even their battle cannons are probably no bigger than 90 millimeters. If they are much larger than that, then they would just be the equivalent of a standard battle cannon, which they probably aren't. They're just firing specialty ammunition. So I cut it off at 90 millimeters. That's just me. Others could have different opinions, and especially for me, I think that armorers can't fire anything above 50 millimeters, and a majority of them are probably using 40 millimeters. But of course, in a larger cartridge, in a much bigger one, that their, gimbaled machinery, heavy technology pieces are able to handle. So, putting a 90 millimeter autocannon on a tank would probably damage the suspension and rip the turret off. If you were really hammering away with it, it would probably damage its own housing. But with a knight, where it's on a gimbal and it's, stabilized and it's able to move and recoil more easily at the disadvantage of being less accurate, absolutely, totally, absolutely fine. Moving on. Sorry, I spent a really long time on that, and I'm going to come back to it anyway. Unique ammunition. Autocannons come in kind of 3 types. The ammo, at least. The first one I would call standard multipurpose. Standard multipurpose is similar to the bolt gun, it's just a capped ballistic round with a small amount of explosive filler. It's designed to work against buildings. It's designed to break, the walls of things. On the small side, this might be something that really is just a pop, or even just a tracer with the 15 millimeter rounds. I could really imagine these on the small end being no different from the heavy machine gun ammunition that we use today. And then on the upper end, it definitely gets to look more like an armor-piercing capped, ballistic capped shell that you'd see for a tank round back in the Second World War. So, pretty basic. It's a steel round or shell with a small amount of high explosive in the center and a cap or a covering. So, it's fairly similar to our autocannons of today that you'll see on armored fighting vehicles and things of that nature, or APCs, armored personnel carriers. The second type is the kind of high explosive and flak. High explosive, obviously, is just a thin metal shell with high explosive in it and a fuse. The other one would be flak, which is either programmable flak or, radar-operated flak, the standard flak that we know of, which is high explosive, but designed with an internal mechanism, or a timer, that allows it to explode when it nears an object, or just, in the case of high explosive, whenever it touches something. High explosive is definitely more useful on the upper level of autocannon. High explosive 15 millimeter rounds is really not going to be of all that much use to anything that's wearing a decent amount of armor. I'm not saying like personal body armor here, I'm saying like vehicles. Personal body armor, you might survive a round if you're in something like light or heavy carapace. With power armor, it's going to be even more difficult to take you down, but it's not impossible. Autocannons are very effective at damaging armor because of their high rate of fire, but you definitely wouldn't want to use high explosive to try and penetrate armor, because you have a very high chance of failing. And then finally, I would say, are the specialty ammunition. The specialty ammo ranges from what it's used for. In general, autocannon ammunition just has a slider of how much punch you're giving versus how much cost the round is. If you wanted to have a pure armor-piercing round, and you had an autocannon, it would be no problem to just make a solid steel round. And that will penetrate a great deal more armor than the standard rounds, because it is both heavier, denser, and it's going faster, because, again, heavier and denser. You can increase the pressure of the ammunition, obviously, but with the autocannon, unlike the autogun where it's really robust, the autocannon has a much higher, output in terms of like pressure on the breech, so I wouldn't mess around with it too much in terms of like higher pressure ammunition. That might be a danger, but other than that, generally when you ask for unique ammunition for the autocannon, it's just going to be, well, how much armor do you want to penetrate? The absolute pinnacle end of this is either adamantium rounds, which are insane, and they're used by pretty much just Armorer Helverins, I think. There's a couple of other ones that claim to use adamantium-tipped rounds, or deuterium tipped rounds, or some of them even say depleted uranium. In any case, it's going to be rounds that are either made entirely out of a unique material, or a super hyperdense material, or a super heavy material, or it's going to be ones that are tipped or capped with a super heavy material, like the bolt rounds are. And those ones will obviously be much more capable of penetrating armor. And, of course, as you get a higher caliber, that will also increase better armor. So, caliber versus rate of fire. This is sometimes arbitrary, but in general, the smaller caliber autocannons make up for their deficiencies by having a higher rate of fire, and the higher caliber autocannons make up for their size, and by make up, I mean they don't want to melt their own barrels off, by having a lower rate of fire. So the higher the caliber, in general, this gets really difficult when we get to the medium ones, because that's kind of in the middle, it can go either way, based on the design, but larger is going to have a lower rate of fire, think chung, 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 shooting, maybe 60 rounds a minute, maybe a little bit more than that, 120. Definitely not on the level of like a light machine gun or a heavy machine gun for that matter, but the small ones are very much going to be firing in small bursts of 5 or 6, or they're going to be laying out just death at 500-ish rounds per minute. So you could easily see a 15mm autocannon beating out a 90mm autocannon 5 rounds to 1 pretty easily. And that is standard because the smaller autocannons need to hit more often in order to get more rounds on target to more effectively damage armor and enemies that they might be facing. Especially because if you're using specialty ammunition that doesn't have explosive filler, you need to guarantee that you hit something vital, which may take 2 dozen, 3 dozen rounds with the small autocannons, where it might only take 2 with the larger ones. A 90mm hole and all of its shrapnel, disregarding any explosive filler, is going to do roughly 8 to 9 times as much, roughly 5 to 6 times as much damage as a 15mm, just because of caliber and velocity. Moving on, semi-low-tech designs. This is a pro and a con. With the pro side of things, it means that planets that didn't have access to heavy weapons like the heavy bolter or the las cannon or the multi-laser, or artillery, because it's very expensive and difficult to engineer artillery, can make autocannons instead. They can make those low-tech, semi-automatic, or even bolt-action, or not really bolt-action, but like semi-automatic, anti-tank gun-esque designs that are 15 to 20 millimeters. There we go. There's your light autocannon that you can use to punch holes through armored cars and such. On the opposite side of things, if you really want something that isn't terrible in modern warfare in 40k, you're gonna need to buy it from a Forge World or from an affiliated industrial world. This is not something that you're just going to find off the street in a gang hideout. It is definitely going to be, if you want a military-grade weapon that doesn't cost you a ton of, doesn't have a ton of high-tech design or, like, pieces to it, isn't a las cannon, isn't a multi-laser, isn't an energy weapon, or something very expensive like a bolt weapon occasionally will be. Again, the heavy bolter is on the cheap end of bolt weapons, but it is still not cheap, and its ammunition is certainly way more expensive. Buying the autocannon is really this kind of budget choice, on the discount end of things, but still needing to be purchased from a Forge World in any case, even if you're producing the ammunition at home. Now, final one. Punch versus weight and effect on armor. So, this is another one of those things where I talk about the caliber affecting how good it is. As mentioned, let's just assume that you're using the standard ammunition and nothing special. The higher caliber autocannons will penetrate more armor, obviously. They are bigger, they are heavier, they are firing with more velocity because they got bigger barrels. In general, obviously, the Lehman Russ ones are a little bit shorter, but still, 50mm autocannon firing fully automatic at 2 barrels a round, you hit something that's wearing body armor, it's probably going to explode. You hit something like a light vehicle, probably going to die, or at least be crippled. But when we're talking about heavy weapons, there's really 2 things that people care about. The first one is, how does it affect armor on vehicles, and how does it affect power armor? Because, of course, this is 40k, I need to talk about power armor. This is the first time that I've done it, other than the few times that I was talking about it in small arms, where it was like, much more of a, well, this isn't a heavy weapon, so why are you using it for that? But, now we get to it. Against powered armor, the autocannon, in my opinion, is either equal, or in some cases superior, to the heavy bolter in terms of damage. The bolt gun may be the standard bolt gun, either used by humans or Space Marines, granted with, the small difference between their calibers and their designs. They are capable of cracking, sizzling off or hitting weak spots in power armor like any other infantry weapons. The heavy bolter is capable of shattering ceramite plating to a greater degree, especially in weak spots and things like that. The autocannon, in my opinion, excels just a little bit beyond the heavy bolter, but no further. The autocannon, in its medium configuration especially, is very capable of shattering weak spots in Astartes plate, even with standard ammunition. A 35mm round coming out of a full-sized autocannon, hitting a Marine in the wrist, hitting him in the forearm, in the shin, in the thigh, in the waist, anywhere other than the chest, shoulders, and probably the lower, greave, maybe that area, is going to shatter the armor and deal damage to the Space Marine. So you aren't talking about, necessarily killing them outright, unless you hit them in the head, obviously. But other than the head, and possibly the guts, you would definitely disable them if you hit them with a good round in the stomach that didn't, bounce off the breastplate or hit a hard piece of, or not adamantium, but hit their, groin piece and hit ceramite or something like that. It has a very high chance of shattering their armor because ceramite is less ductile than steel. It is still ductile, but it is less ductile than plasteel. It has a harder time absorbing kinetic energy and a much easier time absorbing thermal energy. That is, of course, why it is a ceramic coating, or a ceramic material. It can be shattered by autocannons. This is one of the reasons why the autocannon, in my mind, stands out above the heavy bolter, where the heavy bolter does a lot of damage on the back end, and it has a much more lethality than the autocannon can. The heavy bolter doesn't have as many variants, and the heavy bolter, quite frankly, has a harder time, just barely, getting through power armor because it is tipped and not, one solid piece plus some high explosive. The issue as well with the heavy bolter we will get into later, but in general I consider them on par in terms of breaking power armor. In terms of destroying light vehicles, they're also on the same level, with the heavy bolter actually winning out in lethality because it has a high explosive charge, which is considerably larger than the average autogun. Like I mentioned, the heavy bolter, having a caliber of around 35mm, is going to beat out all but the absolute largest of medium autocannons, and the autocannons that are below it are going to be firing at pretty much the same speed, so there really isn't any advantage there. The advantage really comes when you factor in specialty ammunition, which of course exists for the heavy bolter, but it's very rare. Much more common for autocannons. And the fact that the autocannon can, of course, be scaled up to much higher calibers, and that's when we get to medium armor. So, light armor, think armored cars, armored trains, aircraft armor, and, light aircraft, not like the actual Imperial Navy standard stuff. Those vehicles are pretty tough. Or, of course, Space Marine vehicles. But if I'm talking, what a PDF might get their hands on, some sort of modified tracked land crawlers, or some light tanks that are produced on some planet, locally produced, or some, a mix of civilian vehicle and personal body armor. That's what I mean when I say light armor. When I say medium armor, it means anything with less than 100mm of armor. So some vehicles just have 100mm on the front. Others will have, 100mm on the turret for some reason, and then nowhere else. But in general, the autocannon is going to come out on top in comparison to the heavy bolter in this area. The heavy bolter, of course, will hit it. It will crack armor. It will explode and damage components a lot easier. But when you talk about actually penetrating those medium vehicles, those chimeras, those light land crawlers, centaurs, theoretically even rhinos, if you hit them in the right position and they don't bounce off. The higher level of autocannons, the 41 to 90mm, or even some of the 40mm autocannons, have a chance of penetrating and exploding, where the heavy bolter simply can't push through all that armor as well. So, punch versus weight, it really is going to be a trade-off, because once you're getting up into the large autocannons, they're no longer applicable to this kind of field support weapon. You're talking much more emplacements or vehicles. in which case the heavy bolter is, more mobile. It is entirely capable of being moved around, whereas a 41 or a 45 or a 50 millimeter autocannon, you're not going to be picking that up and hauling it to the next position. I know you think you're him, whatever Space Marine this is, but not happening. Really heavy. Moving on to standards, and I have our little trio, our trifecta of nightmare creatures here. Who makes what? Offensive, defensive, and heavy. So, as I said, unless you're talking about the very basic ones, which I've already gone over, those kind of semi-automatic, gravity-fed, or some sort of, bypasses all of the Mechanicus complexity just to make a autocannon that goes bang, just to make one in the first place, it's going to be from a Forge World. In general, everything else got to be from a Forge World. Or an industrial world that makes autocannons. There are plenty of them, because there's lots of autocannon patterns, but in general, I pick out 3 different types. Heavy are just heavy weapons. They're designed to move either on a vehicle or on a platform, like a ship or like a aircraft. Though on tanks it also counts as well. Baneblade, for example, has several different types of autocannon. Offensive and defensive. On the offensive side of things, I put weapons that Space Marines tend to use. So the rotor cannon or the assault cannon, questionable whether the assault cannon belongs in the autocannon category or the bolt weapon category, because while they say it uses bolt rounds in some of the lore, it doesn't seem that it does, and it's used to replace the rotor cannon, which is definitely not a bolt weapon, because it's been around since before bolt weapons were really a thing. So I am on the side that the rotor cannon and the assault cannon are autocannons, like a minigun from our modern day, rather than, high caliber, but still like a minigun from our modern day, rather than a bolt weapon. And on that side, they would fit into the offensive category because they can be moved around. They're light enough to be shifted about. They can be hauled into position. Oh yeah, that's who it is. Try again Bragg with his autocannon. Absolute madness. Another just huge person who manhandles an autocannon like a Marine and just uses it as an infantry weapon. That is what I would consider an offensive option. Something that is light enough to be hauled around the battlefield and follow up with the offensive. If you have a breakthrough, you can't leave your heavy weapon behind. It's light enough that I can pick it up, or me and my 5 or less buddies can grab the autocannon. We're heading off, boys, to the next trench. Set it up in a position, get it ready to go. And then finally, defensive. So, again, heavy are the ones that are too big to be moved at all. Offensive are the ones that have to be light enough to move. Defensive is what I would call the happy medium point. They can be broken down and moved. You don't want to do that, though, because you can't reset them up quickly. Unlike heavy, which you literally can't take apart and then move apart, or take apart and then reset up somewhere else because it's fixed to a position. A lot of anti-aircraft guns would fall into heavy, but defensive ones would be those medium, those heavy on the lower end, that are either like on a hive wall or set up in a precinct house of the Adeptus Arbites, or organized into like a ship defense corridor, anywhere where it's got a realm of fire or an angle of fire, like some nasty angle that you're holding, and it's just like, yep, this is sticking here, and anybody who wants to come try me and my 40mm automatic death machine can gladly turn that corner 300 meters from me, and I will greet them with 500 rounds of fragmentation ammo. Like, that's the type of thing that you're thinking with defensive. It's not going to be something where it's like, all right, me and the boys are going to grab this gun and we're going to haul it to the next position because the commissar said so. But it's going to be that thing of, welp, there's 5,000 Tyranids over that hill. Me and the boys have some sandbags and an hour to kill. Let's dig in this 35mm single barrel and just let rip for 40 minutes and see how many we can kill before we die. So, moving on. Licensed production. Again, local versus forged in this case is really going to come down to forged autocannons are going to have more variety. You're going to get a lot more offensive and heavy ones from forges because they require more materials in terms of heavy. You need a platform, you need servitors to aim it and or just, manage the thing. You need a lot of ammunition storage and technological materials to shift that ammo, belts, automatic feeders, big cassette reloaders that are automatic. The things that knights have that automatically reload their ammo, for example, or, resupply it, that would be an example of something that I would consider heavy and is also definitely from a Forge World. But local autocannons are going to have to make do with other options. Some of them use the big cassette system, and when I say cassette, I'm talking about these things here on this quad mount kind of flak cannon setup. These big circular, they look ribbed, but in reality that's just like curvature so that the rounds can move easier. These kind of drum magazines of rounds. Again, based on the caliber, they probably can't hold more than 50 on the low end, and on the very high end, they probably only carry 6 or 7. So, based on the caliber, you might be hauling around 6 or 7, of these things in your squad, but if everyone's fine carrying all this autocannon ammunition, I'm sure that there's a great deal of use that can be made of it. But that's the local side of things. Forges have a lot more options. They have the ability to have these be belt-fed, and that is the most common solution when it comes to individual movement ones, from either humans, the few of them that can do it, or space marines, or, light vehicles, things of that nature. They will have a belt feed. Whereas the locals are going to have to stick around with having some sort of magazine or a separated belt, something where it's like, okay, let me slowly feed in this, rack instead of having a mechanized belt, which you'll see hanging from Space Marines all the time. They're essentially an assisted belt to make sure that it doesn't jam. Or it'll be like, an ammunition cassette like you have with the 50 cal, where I have 60 rounds in a big box, I stick it on the side of my gun, I feed it through the first couple rounds, and then I can keep going, instead of having to hold the, shell magazine and slowly feed it into the gun like you're a PDF trooper. Again, that's just going to be the difference between local and forged. More foibles, more weird design choices in the local versions, more cool stuff from the forges, if I'm going to be entirely honest, and I like them both. Innovation and degradation. So we already talked a little bit, but we're going to go through the different types. The rotor cannon is that kind of minigun style, multi-barreled every time, rotating so that it's not overheating the barrel. The main goal of the rotor and assault cannon, because, again, the differences between them are basically like who's riding, who's using them. Humans used to be able to use the rotor cannon, but they can't use the assault cannon anymore because reasons. It doesn't work as an infantry weapon, and yet it's on certain infantry vehicles, so disambiguation or confusion aside, this is essentially a way to get an autocannon that is in the small category to shoot at an ungodly speed. An average small autocannon of 15mm might fire at 600 rounds per minute, and that's, a really good speed. That's a great speed. That's blistering for an autocannon. Be careful with melting that barrel, buddy. Try shooting it at 1200 rounds per minute next time, and you'll get the idea of the difference between the rotor cannon and the assault cannon and a standard autocannon. And when I say that these things can shred armor instead of having to penetrate armor like most autocannons, you kind of get what I mean. You get to hit multiple times in the same position, and if you hit a weak spot, you're not going to hit it once. You're going to send 6 or 7 rounds along a line right up that target's, weak spot, essentially. If I'm hitting a Marine, I'm going to chase the dragon, start at his feet, and go up to his face, and I'm either going to hit him in the, ankle, knee, thigh, groin, stomach, throat, face, head. Somewhere there. One of those is going to find a nice juicy spot to bury itself and empty its energy into the target. The rotor and assault cannon tend to not have high explosive. Some of them do, especially when there's some confusion about whether they're bolt or whether they're bullet ammo. But much like a standard minigun from our modern day, they tend to be much lower caliber, definitely on the small end of autocannons, and some of them are even on the higher end of heavy stubbers. But in general, they are considered autocannons and not stubbers of any kind, because they can use very complex ammunition. Generally, autocannons will use cased ammo. When they don't, obviously, again, it is for a particular reason, usually because they're meant to be fed from a backpack or something like that, where the ammunition is not at all exposed to the air and can't be damaged. Cased ammunition, a little bit more durable than caseless. So,
in general, if it's not protected entirely by a sleeve or a feed mechanism, like the Devastators have, or like some Iron Warriors use, like our guy on the first slide, it's going to be cased, much like Heavy Stubbers. And then finally, the last two and slightly one. The last one, the standard, is just the ones I was talking about, that low level, and the Krieg style. I hate to call it Krieg style because it really is just like the most generic image of what an autocannon could be. It's this 20 to 30 millimeter cassette loading 10 round chunk 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 or krrr. Sorry, that sounded absolutely terrible, but like you get the idea. It's between 150 rounds per minute and 300 rounds per minute. So it either shoots off all of its ammunition really quickly and you gotta reload it to get another rip in, or it's chunking out rounds slowly and you can aim between shots. Some of them probably have different dials and settings to allow you to switch back and forth, but that's going to be more forged rather than local because complexity. So that's the standard. The anti-air and vehicle, these really are ones that will have an autoloader hopper. They're set up so that they can fire for a long time, and in the terms of the anti-air, a majority of them, especially the ones that are on ships and on hives, they're rigged to an automated system. Now you might say, well, you can't be an AI system. It's not. It's a servitor, essentially. So they will have multiple servitors having a central fire coordinator, who is usually a person, who can turn them on and off, designate targets for them, and be like, all right, this flight of vehicles is enemy, this flight is ally, don't shoot the allies, shoot the enemies, and these automated systems will just go pow, 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 and turn back. And this is fairly common throughout the Imperium in like hive defenses, though it becomes very prevalent on Navy ships. Even the most basic Imperial ship, the like standard freighter, will probably have an autocannon or a couple of autocannons on its surface to do one of two things. One, it can protect from rocks and other stuff floating in the void. Two, it can sometimes be enough to see off pirates. Or boarders or other enemies. Even if they aren't armed, having an autocannon aboard is really important just so that you can protect yourself. And while not all anti-aircraft units are autocannons, plenty of them are laser weapons for, obvious reasons of I don't want to reload the space gun. In a lot of cases, it is autocannons because that's going to be cheaper. Not in the long run, but when I build my ship and I have to pay for every little inch of it, I don't want to spend an extra 50% to get a multi-laser. I'm just buy the autocannon. It costs me $30. So, again, going there. And with vehicles, obviously we've already gone over the Lehman Russ. Tanks will have them. They are generally no different from the standard. They either work as spotting weapons or they just work as mobile or mobile heavy weaponry. Poor man's heavy bolters, some people call them, but again, as we've discussed, it is sometimes downright superior to the heavy bolter. But I would say that most vehicles don't use anything above the medium caliber, and a vast majority of them that aren't using them as main weapons, especially the Lehman Russ, probably uses them in the 30mm to 35mm range. And I would even say lower at the 25mm, or even lower at the 23 would be reasonable if it wasn't the Lehman Russ and if it was some other kind of, secondary vehicle. Like if I was using a Reaver and its central hull mount was going to be replaced with an autocannon, I would probably use a 25 or a 30mm just to save space. And theoretically so that I could double up and get a second gun there. But we'll get to that in a second. Variants and platforms. So, we see some of our beloved favorites up here. The Dorado Dreadnought, I believe he is. The Dorado, excuse me. 2 heavy bolters in the chest, 4 Aegis autocannons. He's doing a whole lot here, I'm sure. Our lovely Chaos Venerable Dreadnought. Remember how I said that these will often have a single barrel 35, or in this case, 2 30s or 2 25s with a saw blade and a nasty saw blade. God, I love this model. It's so cool. Night Lord's Dreadnoughts are such a glory to behold. And then the lovely Hammerin' Helverin, the Armiger, with its likely 40mm long autocannons. So some people have gotten upset with me before for saying that these are low caliber autocannons because it's got so much AP. I think that these would be reasonable if they were lower caliber, firing high velocity shells that are made for armor penetration. Because they do penetrate a lot of armor. I do agree with that. They can penetrate tanks from the side. They can kind of hammer their way through heavier armor, hitting the same spot and kind of denting the armor in over and over again, because they're so accurate and they're well jointed and augmented. And of course, you know, they're mobile, so they can run around a target and hit them in multiple directions. I think it's reasonable to say that those are way lower caliber than people think they are. Like, you know, even down to 25, but they're hitting with solid steel ammunition or, you know, some sort of adamantium tipped rounds, and they're firing at a very high rate of fire. Granted, the armor could probably only do that for so long before it runs out of ammunition, but it does look like it has a double set of ammo, in addition to possibly carrying a reload for itself. I will give them the benefit of the doubt, because I know Knights players are very militant about this. I've argued with a lot of them. So, we've gone over tanks, we've gone over the Knights that have them. Some Knights have a lot bigger ones, but again, we get to that whole, it's basically just a semi-automatic anti-air gun that you've made into a tank gun and then stuck onto an arm. It's going to fire much slower because of the, you know, sheer recoil of the weapon is going to need to be managed, and if you just fire off rounds at high speed with a 90mm cannon, you're going to rip your arm off. If not, you know, just ruin your aim. You don't want to be firing into the ground by your third shot, or firing into the sky for that matter, so you probably want to fire once, reload, well, fire once, give it a second to reload, fire again. You know, not semi-automatic necessarily, but, you know, chunking through slowly, definitely more reasonable for Knights. The few Titans that have quote-unquote auto weapons, it's a lot closer to a minigun in most cases, so I'm not going to include it here, because the shells that they fire are much closer to cannons than they are to autocannons. Dreadnoughts, as we've talked about, they'll have an arm mount, and luckily, Dreadnoughts, much like Halverins, have a lot of space to store ammunition. So totally reasonable for them to just hammer on for the entire conflict. And of course, Space Marines and Knights have access to very specialty ammunition and can use it to penetrate armor. So very useful on Dreadnoughts, very useful on Knights. Kind of a little bit less useful on tanks because, you know, if a tank sees another tank and one of them is only equipped with autocannons, I think you can guess who is going to win that fight. But Leman Russ, it has the option to equip, you know, heavy armor-piercing weapons in addition to its autocannons. The interesting, or the funny thing, is really when you get down to things like the Chimera, and you arm that with autocannons, and, well, you've kind of made a monster here, because it can theoretically mount both an autocannon and a las cannon. You know, whether or not you can afford that as a regiment, that is very expensive, but, you know, reasonably, that's a very all-round vehicle, except for, you know, it being a hull mount, but still, cool. Aircraft, lots of aircraft use autocannons as either a primary, a secondary, or a defensive weapon. The same way that anti-aircraft platforms use the flak rounds to hit aircraft that are lighter and, you know, try and damage their engines and things like that. Imperial aircraft tend to be very well armored, but Imperial aircraft aren't the only ones out there. There are plenty more, and, you know, even flying enemies in 40k, so there's lots of reasons to still use flak rounds, even if a lot of the opponents that you're fighting have armor on their ships. Not every piece of an aircraft can be armored, otherwise it wouldn't fly. A little note to Space Marines, saying that your ships are a flying brick means that they're not flying anymore. There are plenty of weaknesses to the Thunderhawk, and they have been elaborated on many, 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 many times, and I'm not going to do it right now, but I will do it later when we get to Space Marine vehicles. So, again, used on aircraft as main or as defensive weaponry, and then used by AA, by anti-aircraft artillery, in order to take down aircraft. Double, triple, and quad. There are good reasons to double up autocannons. The first one is if you're firing, like the Dorado Dreadnought is, one round out of one cannon and then another out of another, using a single or doubled up feed system, it reduces the wear and tear on the barrel and on the recoil system as it helps balance out the recoil. So one gun recoils, as it's undoing its own recoiling, the next one recoils, the spring that's holding both of them back is taking less pressure each time as it's pushing back the other one, you know, kind of like delayed blowback or delayed recoil. Very effective. Most of these guns are recoil operated. The ones that aren't are the mechanical ones, like the ones on Knights and some of the Dreadnought ones. Some of the very high-end Forge ones also are not recoil operated. They're, you know, belt-fed with some sort of electronic mechanism. I wouldn't be surprised even if the vehicle ones were solenoid fired or somehow electrically primed. But still, double, It's generally to keep it from overheating. Triple, you rarely see this, but when you do see it, it's because they're rotating barrels like a rotor cannon. And quad is really used on anti-aircraft guns more than anything, and it's so that the flak shells or the armor-piercing shells or any shells that you may be using have a higher chance to hit the target because of the high rate of fire of many autoguns at that caliber. A 35mm autocannon has a chance to trace up a vehicle, but if you have 4 of them, you have a much higher chance of just having a servitor aim in the general direction and hit it. So the reason why a lot of those Hydra flak batteries or those automated hive defenses are quad mounted is because the people who are aiming them are very fallible, and the equipment assisting them is relatively inferior to something like a Dreadnought system or a Space Marine's helmet even. A servitor is not very good at figuring out where an aircraft is going to be based on visual analysis. They might be assisted or designed for that purpose, but, that's more expensive than just having a basic one with a tracking system. Specialty ammo effects on armor. I've already been over this. I think I wrote it down twice by accident. Again, with metal, it's going to hammer through or it's going to outright penetrate. Unlike the heavy bolter, it's got less mass of explosive behind it, so the damage after effects on armor, and especially light armored enemies, might be inferior to what you want. This only really comes into play with orcs and tyranids. With humans, if a heavy bolter hits you and you're not in heavy carapace armor, or it hits you slightly and you're in light carapace armor, you're probably dead, or at least you're missing a limb. With the bolt gun, you have a much higher chance of surviving with even just full flak armor or heavy flak armor, and a much higher chance, almost a guarantee, of surviving if you're in heavy carapace or light carapace, if it doesn't hit you dead on. Even if it hits you in dead on and you have heavy carapace, there's a pretty solid chance that you're coming out of that alive. The specialty ammo for the autocannon is much more based on penetration, whereas the specialty ammo for bolt weapons and for its other competitors are based on, having some special after armor effect. Autogun doesn't really care much. Very simple. Penetrate, explode, or penetrate and don't explode. So, moving on to importance and logistics. Here's my favorite one, or one of my favorites. The lovely Chaos Autocannon. It's basically a giant double barrel. Or in this case, it's a beautiful double barrel, like 25mm. Love these guns. Love the ones that the Terminators use. They really are one of my absolute favorite weapons at 40k. Kind of a reimagining, a modernized version down here in comparison to the bolter. Kind of double the size of the shell, big old 50 cal round. 50 cal could technically be an autocannon, I guess. You'd probably have to size it up to 15mm, in my opinion, to really make it an autocannon and not a heavy machine gun. So definitely like somebody's reimagining of a Terminator autocannon in that case. And then the lovely quad kind of 1960s Vietnam era watercolor of a Hydra flak battery absolutely hammering away at the skies. Man, I was so happy to find that art. That's so pretty. Alright, users' importance and logistics. For the PDF, the autocannon really is only going to come into play if you have a very advanced PDF that's using the very basic. It's interesting. Unlike the autocannon, where an advanced PDF might be using an at least decent autogun, the autocannon, even the most advanced PDF, is only going to get the most basic of autocannons. Some local semi-automatic little plinker 15mm or some kind of super heavy machine gun that looks super impressive to the local population, but to an Imperial Guardsman would be like, what is that little pop gun? Look at my 32mm rolled, anti-armor autocannon over here that I can just, bam, punk away with and destroy, these light vehicles with. So the PDF, it's really not that common. When they come into contact with it, it will be via defensive structures. So those servitor-manned autocannons that are used for hive defense, the PDF would know how to operate those. They would figure out how to be the fire control director for them, and that would be part of their job as, like, wall defenders. This brigade knows how to do that. Chaos likes autocannons a lot, and I've noticed this, and, definitely not a little bit of Chaos bias coming through in the fact that I, too, like autocannons. But it's for two reasons. One, the Chaos side doesn't have access to as many bolt weapons as the Imperium does, for the simple fact of both the bolt weapons are more expensive to produce, maintain, and to get ammo for, but in addition to that, the autocannon serves a huge variety of purposes within Chaos. It is a light offensive weapon in some cases. These cut down 15mm heavy machine guns that, a big monstrous Chaos Hulk or some huge Ogrin who's been corrupted, or even like a really yoked out Cornet follower can grab this thing that, he wields like a light machine gun that he's firing from the hip because he's just so monstrous strong. And on the other hand of things, you have, oh, so you're telling me that I can have a relatively cheap, pretty easy to equip, reliable and robust, granted, semi-automatic, slow-firing, high-caliber armor-piercing weapon, and I can just have that and have it be made for me with relative ease, in comparison to, las cannon, heavy bolter. All these other options are either too indirect, like with explosives like the mortars, or too small, like a grenade launcher, or like a sniper, or a heavy stubber. The autocannon is this sweet middle spot for Chaos Forces, which is really why I think it's become so popular, because it can penetrate armor, it can damage Space Marines. It's hard, it's difficult, and especially to put them down, it's more difficult still, but it can do it. I don't have to feel as impotent with my little autogun trying to shoot into the weak spots of their armor, or shoot their face, or like go for their throat or groin, or hit them in the stomach with my, my like 5 rounds of specialty ammo that I have as a cultist. I can have a real weapon that can actually do some damage to these horrifying monsters that I'm facing. And I think that really gives them a lot of confidence around the autocannon that they don't have around weapons that require more maintenance, more logistics, or are harder to produce, like the heavy bolter. Even as common as the heavy bolter is, if I were a Chaos Cultist, I would choose the autocannon because I'm likely to have more and better quality and more, choice rounds. Heavy bolter, I'm probably not going to get the super special ammo that the Deathwatch use. If I'm a cultist, I'm probably going to get a bunch of standard rounds, which aren't really great for doing in Space Marines, but if I have my autocannon from the Dart Mechanicus or from the Iron Warriors, they might have given me a strip of heavy armor-piercing rounds. Heck yeah, I'm going to slide that right into my autocannon. I see that Ultramarine over there, and I want to earn a name for myself, gosh darn it. For the Dark Gods. Bang, 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 bang. So, moving on from that, Guardsmen. Guardsmen have a love-hate relationship with the autogun, or the autocannon. On the one hand, you do have your Colonel Strackens, your Braggs, your Catachan fighters who can, big manhandle grab light little autocannon and just rip off from the hip and shred stuff like we're in Rambo and we're messing up the foliage. There's that side of things, that macho manhood, but there's also the Cadian side of things, or what I like to call the, well, why not? It's for units that have a lot of heavy weapons. So, units that are like, oh, well, we are a heavy support regiment. We're expected to, hold the line here. Holding the line requires you to have 2 things in abundance. Weapons that can put down a lot of enemies quickly, and weapons that can put them down reliably. There is nothing about the autocannon that makes it inferior to the heavy bolter in this regard, other than flare and, having a higher effect on target. In the cases of big heavy Tyranids, they'll both penetrate, but the heavy bolter's definitely a better one to put them down. In terms of orcs, the autocannon will definitely kill them, but the heavy bolter will make sure that they're actually dead. I wouldn't trust a 15mm autocannon to put down a raging orc horde, even though it's firing at the same speed or higher speed than the heavy bolter. I'm going to take the heavy bolter because there's a guarantee that every person I hit with this 35 to 40mm round is going to die, and I'm not going to have to shoot them again. So for them, it's like a trade-off. Do I want a heavy bolter? Do I want an autocannon? In general, that's the medium to medium-high level of thinking with the Imperial Guard. Some guardsmen do use heavy stubbers, but really, most of them probably would want to upgrade to an autocannon just because stubbers are known for jamming, and autocannons are usually protected against that, or at least they are less susceptible to it because the ammunition that they use tends to be bigger, and bigger ammo tends to mean less chance to jam, or at least easier jams to clear. With bigger guns, I don't have to dig down into the guts and grab a tiny little mangled casing that's keeping me from firing. I could just rack that son of a bitch right back and grab this big piece of brass and yeet it out and get back into fighting. Unlike, you know, some light machine guns or heavy machine guns where I'm going to have to pull up this big top rack and grab this and pull that. I just rack it with the autocannon. And there's a pretty solid chance I can see into the chamber, fit my fingers in, and grab it around and throw it out. Space Marines, Chaos Space Marines. Same thing with Space Marines will use the autocannon in very specialty ways. They like that special ammo. They like ones that will penetrate armor. They also like to use them sometimes for snipers and other things. You'll see sometimes, like, again, when I've seen people asking about, like, why didn't you mention sniper rifles in the autogun video? I'm going to be getting to the specialty variants that belong to individuals in the Imperium in other videos. I am going to get to it. I promise I will. It might take me a while, but you've seen I am doing this. I promise. I am going with it. I'm going through with it. So Space Marines, they'll use it for specific purposes, but it's not a generic weapon for them. They don't tend to just take it on faith. They tend to pick other things like plasma guns, like melta-guns. They pick things that really give them a giant edge in one way. You know, they don't really need a middle-of-the-road, median, meet all enemies that come weapon. They need something that's like, well, our bolters aren't doing it. Call up the dude with the special weapon. That's what they are going to use more often than not, rather than, well, our bolters can't do it. Can the autocannon do it? Kind of, but not really. Darn it, I wish we brought a melta-gun. Like, that's the situation that Space Marines are really going to run into. And since they have the choice, of course, of picking whatever weapons they feel like, that is certainly going to be something they are going to overlook more often. And then Chaos Space Marines. Chaos Space Marines have more of a love-hate relationship than their cultist counterparts, but they have a higher rate of appreciation for the autocannon because it fits that all-around role. And the other thing, and one of the interesting things for me, is that because the autocannon can replace both the heavy bolter, it can also theoretically replace a Marine's bolt gun. If you have a light autocannon that is in the 20mm range, the difference between you equipped with a, you know, high-tech specialty ammunition bolt gun and your slightly bigger and bulkier, but still 25mm autocannon is pretty much nil. The damage that you're going to do is going to be equivalent to the other Marines, and quite frankly, you're probably going to have better accuracy over them anyway. So the Chaos Space Marine equipped with the autocannon could be, you know, doing it for, you know, I gotta deal with every threat, I gotta be ready for this or that or that or the other thing, and I want to have my big gun ready. Or it could just be, the warband doesn't have any more bolt guns because they cost too much, and the last ones that we had got given to the new guys. Here's the autocannon that we ripped off of a servitor 5 months ago. It does about the same thing. Go take this into battle. That is legitimately how I see that going with a bunch of warbands. It's just, we don't have a bolt gun to give you. Here's an autocannon, because they're more common and they do about the same thing. Go have fun. And that's a pretty interesting thing with Chaos Space Marines that I think they would have a good appreciation for it, and why they do have a good appreciation for it. Finally, moving on, because I know this is going to be a long video. Imperial Navy, Mechanicus, Planetary Defense, Merchant Service. All of these come in with those automated defensive turrets that shoot down. For the Imperial Navy, it's like, oh, well, we need to shoot down torpedoes, and we need to shoot at little enemy fighter ships or bombers. They're the anti-aircraft for them. For the Mechanicus, they use a lot of weird variants of the autocannon from, like, Cognis weapons, which are essentially just better servitorized weapons that are also better in general. They're just like a master-crafted version of the autocannon, which is cool, but really, they're still just hooked up to a robo-brain at the end of the day, or if they're slave to a Tech Priest Dominus, that's a little bit cooler. That's, we're talking like somebody who is actively able to move around the weapon at will, like it's some sort of evil crows system. So yeah, Mechanicus, their own thing. We'll get to them eventually. I'm not a huge fan, so I kind of give them short shrift. Sorry to all the AdMech fans out there. But Planetary Defense Forces, as I said, basically just defensive. Very rarely will you have a PDF that can afford a true autocannon in general service. When you do, it'll be in isolated pockets. They'll probably choose to use it defensively because that's what the PDF is for. Same thing with local army. If there was a local army that had autocannons, I would be putting an inquisitorial presence on their planet because, man, that is a very dangerous local army if they're able to make autocannons a pretty standard support weapon. Matter of fact, I might, want to sanction them for that, but that's just the, interior inquisitor speaking. In general, they're not going to have it. Local army, they just aren't going to be equipped with it, and if they are, it's going to be archaic down to the level of, comparison of the autocannon in the guard versus the autocannon that might be used in a local army unit is going to be the difference between a top-of-the-line Hellgun and a Laslock. It's night and day. Yeah, they can kind of do similar things, but it has more to do with them using the same concept and cartridge than the actual weapon itself. Most of the local army and planetary defense weapons are going to be garbage or just above garbage. Finally, the merchant service. As I said, even the most mean, bare, cold freighter in the Imperium, those kind of, everyone's in cryo sleep for 20 years as we go from planet to planet, and we just slowly burn in one direction and then flip over and burn in the other direction, and we kind of slow down and we figure out how we're going, and, that not autonomous, but like low crew, maximum time, minimum efficiency, even those ships will have a defensive turret aboard. It might just be like one little pew 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 20mm autocannon, but they will all have them for the bare minimum reason that if they run into an asteroid field or some other type of interference where a gun will do the trick to break up these things, the 20mm is gonna really be all you need, and for the most part, these ships will have, especially military ones will have more than that, but the merchant service, they might have a single one. They might have a dual mount or a quad mount if they're fancy, or a couple different mounts. Again, as much variety of these as there are variety of ships. If you're on a Tarask merchantman, you might have something really archaic, but if you're on like a regular freighter, like a warp freighter, you would be pretty confident in being like, we have 2 up above and 2 down below. They're sitting right in front of the bridge so that we don't get anything hitting the windows. That's the main thing. And I say that mostly because Chaos Cults will also strip the autocannons off of those ships and use them as heavy weapons, which is my other absolute favorite thing about 40k, is that you can just strip certain weapons and they work as heavy support weapons, which is a great reason to love the autocannon. Moving on to acknowledgements. You guys have been so great. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do a second upload. I know I promised that it might be coming, it might not be, but this has been such a great set of videos. I'm so excited. I am doing it in this order because I haven't mentioned it yet. I am doing weapons first, including melee weapons. So I'm going to do weapons first, then I'm going to do armor, then I'm going to start doing factions, then I'm going to start doing logistics and things like, how does warp travel work? How does communications work? How does the Imperial bureaucracy work? I'm really excited to do, like, how do Imperial worlds work? I want to explain that, kind of give a logical, rational explanation, because whenever in 40k we get an experience with a quote-unquote Imperial world, or a standard Imperial world, we have these issues of, well, who's actually in charge? Who put them in charge? If there's this calcified bureaucracy, how did that happen? Why is this like that? Who gave rise to what in this situation? Who's actually in charge here? Is it the Imperium? Do they have independence? Are they not independent? What's the tithe like? How does the economy work? This is one of the really big things, like, how does the economy work in 40k? How are these people, how do they eat? How do they make money? How is there still electricity on this world? After things have gone so horribly wrong. But yes, I'll be getting into all of that in later videos. But first, I really want to get these quote-unquote baseline equipment ready, so that people can look back and be like, well, he said autocannons can't do this. Let's go back and look at the autocannon video, see what he says. Again, these are my interpretations based on both real life and the evidence taken in from 40k. I'll be going into other things. Like, I've already missed some stuff in the last cannon video for, like, Mythos, but they would probably fit into the Space Marine video because it's about Space Marines. A lot of the Mythos stuff is going to get brought back when I talk about stuff like autocannons and lasguns and autoguns, and I don't want people being like, well, it never says that. Understand that this is me creating the baseline of the Mythos, of the, Archon's army, of my version of these equipment. Again, based entirely off the lore and off of evidence. I'm using the best possible sources that I have, and I am absolutely willing to debate this with anyone. This is not just a foregone conclusion. I'm not going to get, too in the weeds about this kind of stuff. But you'll understand as we go. One will build upon the other, so it's going to be weapons, armor. Then we get to, individuals like Space Marines, factions, that kind of stuff, and then we'll get to world building. And at the very end of it, I will probably chuck in Corrupt Contenders and get a whole RP thing going, hopefully, because I'm really excited to shoot this whole, 5-year text RP project out to the world and see what everybody thinks about it. It's supposed to be building on world logic. So that's how things are going. I wish you all a lovely good night and evening.